Welcome back, everyone. This is day 2 of COVID-19 Borders in the Law, or welcome for the first time if you weren't able to join us yesterday. This is the third panel on interdisciplinary perspectives, including presentations on political theory, fieldwork, archival research. Our chair is Michael Eng, legal historian here at HKU Law, and I'll let him lead off with some first introductions.
Thanks very much, Chris. So, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon or good morning, depending on which part of border are you in. So therefore, welcome to join us the third panel of this virtual conference on COVID-19 borders and the law. And this is a third panel, as Chris mentioned, and this panel will focus on politics of the borders as well as the history of border politics. And today we are very happy to have three speakers speaking to us from a different part of the world, from University of Leiden, University of Macau, as well as here, University of Hong Kong. So just a very quick housekeeping rules. Today's speakers will use about 15 to 20 minutes to present on his topics. And then after finishing all three presentations, we'll have a Q&A sessions or commentary sessions. If you would like to comment or ask questions, you have two options. You can either type out your questions or comments so that I will read them out for you, or you can use your raise hand functions. If I see your hand raised, then I'll ask you to ask in person if you wish to. Otherwise, you can share with us your question and I can read them out for you. So our first speaker is Matthew Longo. So Matthew is assistant professor of political science at Leiden University, and his research interest includes global politics of borders, sovereignty, as well as security. And today his presentation is on after COVID-19, states, border, and the new politics of exclusion. Over to you, Matthew. Oh, Matthew, yeah, you're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Great. Let me just share my screen. Can someone confirm that the screen shares okay, that you can see?
Yes.
Wonderful. So thank you for this. This is wonderful to be part of. I will be offering a perspective that draws on research I've done in a number of different settings over the years about borders, with a particular spin in two directions. The first is, of course, towards COVID, and thinking in a very future-looking way about the ways in which COVID has shaped us and the significance that has, but also in a past-looking way, in which I will call on quite a bit of history, specifically history of the US-Mexico borderlands. So I will do both these things, but to begin, I'm going to give a little bit of an overview about borders. So to begin, here's where I am coming from. My first book came out a few years ago, and it was designed, it's a political science book. Political science is my discipline. And it's really looking at the idea of borders as institutions and trying to ask what happens when we start to view borders outside of their simply juridical construct as jurisdictional lines and more as filled out political institutions. So I wanted to ask questions about sovereignty and about citizenship. I come out of the subdiscipline is political theory and political philosophy. I'm interested in broad moral questions and conceptual ones about states and the relationships they have with their populations and so forth. So I wanted to ask what it looked like to actually go to a border and see how those relationships played out in a real time live sense, right? Not just looking at maps, not just looking at or reading texts that are drawing most of their ideas from maps, but actually going to borders. So I went and spent a time in basically between 2011 and about 2016 in and around the US-Mexico borderlands and US-Canada borderlands. So what did I find? What did I focus on? Because I want the talk to be forward-looking, I'm going to sort of zoom ahead quickly and just discuss three things that I think are essential trends we've seen in bordering. I think this may be the most helpful, most interesting for this conference. So the three are, the first is externalization. I think this is probably a word that's now become quite familiar, certainly to people that work on borders generally, but also people that are even just reading the news. So externalization means that putatively internal processes of border controls end up being extended externally, right? So rather than make the decision about the border at your own gate, in the mythological sense, you don't wait until the barbarian is at the gate. What you do is you put the border controls all the way far away so that you have to pass into borders or layers of bordering before you even get to the national border. So in the American context, this means that we're not just concerned with the Mexican border or Mexicans crossing. We're also concerned about putting up borders in, for example, Central America and funding Mexican border guards and training Mexican border guards to create a barrier system between, say, Mexico and Guatemala. This is not for Mexico's sake. This is for our sake. We're concerned with, in this case, Central American migrants getting into Mexico, after which they would get into the United States. And so the externalization of the border means locating a nation's border into the nation that's either neighboring it or even beyond. We see this also in Europe. You'll notice that European borders now mostly take place in Africa, often very far deep into Africa. A second trend is cooperation. One of the things that emerged after 9/11 is the realization that states faced similar threats. So, for example, if the threat was terrorism, as it was in those days, states understood that actually terrorism is a threat to all states, and therefore it made sense to cooperate. So borders stopped being mono-sovereign domains and started to become plurally sovereign domains where you'd actually have a lot of sharing between and among border guards at the border, often co-locating, which is a way of saying that, if it's country A and country B, the border forces of country A had a zone of permissibility to actually enact country A's policies in country B and vice versa. The example I talk about a lot in my book is actually about the US-Canada borders, that we now have joint patrols in the waters, right? So take like the waters of like Lake Michigan. It used to be the problem that, if there was a person running drugs or something, some bad guy in the American idea sense, the police sense, all they had to do was get on a motorboat with all their drugs, hop on the boat and zoom away to just across the border and be in Canada and be free. That's obviously fine for the border runner, but for the police, that's unstable. So once you identify the threat, in this case of drugs, but it could have been terrorism or could have been migration, as being something that states share, it only makes sense, it makes rational sense to share resources, to catch them together. And the third trend is digitalization. I think this is something everybody understands, certainly in the parts of the world that are incredibly heavily developed. I mean, obviously Hong Kong is part of that conversation, as is Europe and the US. But digitalization means that a lot of our information is passed along, it's transferred via digital channels, it's kept digitally. We now have ways of predicting people's behaviors and their risk profiles based on algorithms. We're now able to cull from vast quantity of data, even data we think of as putatively private, either from private companies, so we can think like for some social media companies. We know that border guards frequently use Facebook accounts to track people. Same is true of bank accounts and telephone records and so forth. So these are sort of trends. This is the kind of world of bordering we now inhabit. And one kind of question you can ask is to what to make of these trends. And one of the interesting things is, if you go back and think historically about borders, part of what's happening with externalization, which is the broadening of a border zone, co-location is the widening of that zone in both directions, digitalization is the deterritorialization of the border, is we're seeing a little bit of a return to the old imperial models of frontiers, right? Where rather than being a fixed linear jurisdictional line, the way we think of a border now, instead it's actually something more zonal, right? Where the areas in which states claim some kind of authority peters out with distance, right? It isn't fixed in any way and actually expands and contracts. What that means is that we're actually seeing, or we are or should be forced to rethink quite a bit we know about states and borders and territory, where actually we assume that states and borders and territories are married together. We often define a state as a bounded political unit. We define a border as the edge of a state. That relationship is perhaps to be troubled or even eliminated. One of the interesting things about the historical view is that, we didn't transition suddenly from empires to states. Actually, the history of state development is a 500 or 600 year process. And it's really only at the tail end of that process. It was the 19th century that states really started to curtail imperial advances and start to think of borders as fixed. In the European sense, this really only happened with the collapse of Napoleon in 1815. And then subsequently with all the time taken to demarcate and actually build up borders. It's really a 20th century phenomenon that borders look like we think they do, these thin linear jurisdictions, as opposed to what they've always been, which is far more oscillating, almost like an accordion, expanding in and out. So this is the way we might interpret these trends, as bringing back pre-modern forms of authority that we had thought were gone, but actually are reemerging. So that's one kind of lesson we can draw. But all of that's set up to say that I think there's really interesting things we can learn about and think about vis-a-vis COVID. And COVID is obviously a very present problem, but I think the questions it asks are roughly similar. It asks us to rethink the relationship between borders and pandemics, as pandemic as a kind of threat that face a border that might be discrete from the threat, say, immigration poses or terrorism poses, but it might not be. And I want to ask whether or not we can reconsider some of the trends I just talked about with pandemic in mind. So how do we go about doing that? The way I want to do it, in part inspired by this panel, I am not by nature or discipline a historian. As I said, I'm a political scientist. But it occurred to me when the pandemic hit that I had probably read lots of things in all my readings, all my years reading about borders, about pandemics or viruses or any kind of public health concern. I had never really thought about them or flagged them in any way. Those were not what I was looking at, wasn't what I was studying. And that occurred to me now would be a really good project to go back and try to reread and learn about how viruses have affected the way borders are built. So with that in mind, I want to do a little bit of a detour into the history of the US-Mexico border. This is, I should say, an extension of my work, but it's not principally my work, right? This is something I'm learning also, but I think I can weave it back into a story about the present. So hear me out. The basics. So I want to take you all the way back into the 19th century, all the way back into the 1840s. And in the 1840s, the American-Mexican border was first demarcated and allocated. It was at the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, that was 1846. And you'll note, if anybody has American topography in mind, although I imagine in this room perhaps not many people do, but that's okay. The first half of the border, right, the eastern half of the border is really simple. I think I wrote this down wrong, sorry. The eastern half of the border is really simple. It's a river, it's the Rio Grande. It's only the western half of the border that was really hard to figure out because it was empty desert. And so, about a decade later, they start to really start to define the border, but it's still empty. It's an empty land. And you have to really try to put it into your mind. Like, this is roughly unpopulated. There are outposts. The largest at the time was El Paso. There are, of course, Indian reservations. There's lots of different kinds of people out there. But in the broad brush, this is empty land. Frankly, it's still fairly empty. The American West is incredibly, if you've ever seen pictures of the Sonoran Desert, it's very unpeopled still. And so you're thinking about a territory that involves a lot of, cactuses and dust bunnies. And it's really, you've had images of the Wild West. It's really an empty desert. So the question is, how do you go about creating a border in this desert? So they actually, they tried. And what did they achieve? The first thing they did was they demarcated it. It lost almost all of its demarcation by the 1880s. They had to re-demarcate it. To give you an idea of how empty it was, literally they had painted stones, and all the painted stones, just by 30 years of nature and winds and desert storms, and had been either the paint had worn off or had been unable to notice them, or the rocks had knocked off their little pyramids and so forth. So starting in the 1870s, you start to get development. And in the 1880s, you start to have a new attempt to really make it more border-like. So I'm going to quote here a couple quotes from a book by Rachel St. John called Line in the Sand, because she's done a history in a way that, of course, I haven't. So she writes, the boundary, originally marked with an inadequate number of monuments, many of them unsubstantial without distinctive features, had become almost obliterated, right? So now it's 50 years later almost, and they're basically saying we don't even have a border, right? There's no way to even distinguish the two sides. To make this point and bring it home, it started to become an issue by the 1890s, because the 1890s, there had been a railway come through and there had been a gold rush, and border towns were really building up, and commerce was very hard to control or traffic. And this made a real mess. To give you two more quotes from St. John, there was a new climate, which the International Boundary Commission reported in 1896, of, quote, open yet lawful evasions of customs duties. So I'm speaking to a room of legal scholars. I imagine all of you find the word open yet lawful evasions of customs duty as almost absurd, right? It is lawful evasion is a way of them simply saying, we can't monitor this. We don't have the tools. We have the legal authority to say you are on one side or the other, but there isn't a border. There's nothing there. To put it into really distinct terms, came about with involving crime. A great quote also from Resource St. John. She reports from the Douglas Daily Dispatch, that's an Arizona local newspaper, who says the officer who goes down there at night finds it impossible to tell where the line is and whether he's arresting a man in the US or Mexico, right? It's literally impossible to even know where the border is. Okay, this is all a fairly elaborate way of painting a picture. I want you to really feel right now what it's like to be a policeman trying to catch a criminal and not even know what country they're in. Okay. So what happened? How did we go from this wild terrain to what we have now? What was the kind of precipitating event to change the borderlands? One of the interesting answers, it's not the only one, one of the interesting answers was pandemic. It turns out that there was a problem of cattle, not people, and in particular tick-bitten cattle. Right? This is often called Texas fever. And starting in the 1880s, these cattle would cross the border willy-nilly. Of course, there was no border. Why would they not? But the Americans were concerned that tick-bitten cattle were coming in from Mexico. How do you stop that? How do you stop cattle, these raging cattle? They had all these systems. They wanted to dunk them in petrol, because apparently petrol kills the tick, but not the cow. So they would, cows are big animals. They would tie the cow from their feet by this big crane and dip the cow into petrol and lift it back up. This is what they were trying to do. Of course, it wasn't effective. So what happens? You have this crisis, right? That and actually gets into the news. So Eula Biss, who's another writer, I wrote a great book about immunity and more about viruses and inoculation in the US. Said that you had this issue becoming essentially popular news. It was in the media. It was called incredibly racialized terms. This illness in cattle, like the Mexican bump and other things I won't say on Zoom. And so you have this climate. So what happens? In 1909, the Bureau of Animal Industry, a US body, said, okay, well, the only way we're going to stop this problem of pandemics is to build a fence. And that was the first federal funding ever allocated towards fencing on the US-Mexico border. It was in California. So obviously, a little bit of stretch of fence in California for what is a giant, more than 1,000-mile expanse is going to do very little, but it's a start. Okay, so moving forward, and this is going to get very quick. We're going to do a real whistle-stop tour of the history here, but I just want to plant the seeds in your head, then we'll talk about them. Lots of different immigration rules starting in the 1870s, 1880s, famously the Chinese Exclusion Act, where a racial group was targeted to try to eliminate them. But of course, if you can't close your border, having an act doesn't do anything. Maybe you can close the port of entry and then they just go around it, right? They didn't do much. It was only really in the 1910s, when there was violence in Mexico, that people started to care about wanting to build more fencing. And then finally, 1917 was the first really comprehensive Immigration Act. Also, we should note, it's amazing how recently that was, right? This is basically a century ago, that started to have the ports of entry be tightened. And now we have the ingredients of what we would call the modern border, right? We have a ports of entry start to tighten restrictions, and there's a little bit of fencing. So how do we get from this kind of stage of kind of open, kind of closed, basically unenforceable customs laws, immigration laws that are now passed as act of Congress but don't really exist on the ground? How do we get that to like our current border? Interestingly, one answer was pandemic again. So in 1917, there was a new problem, but this was not cattle born. It was in people. It was typhus. And this is a really big issue. But the government responded by basically radically securing ports of entry, like in a way that had never been done before, huge amounts of funding into ports of entry. And in particular, the justification came from the US public health officials, which is to say that Mexicans coming in were virus carriers. So they were asked to give up their baggage, which was sterilized. They were asked to strip naked. They were sprayed. And of course, they had lots of invasive disinfection processes. And you'll notice, as anyone who's ever been taken to secondary, questions of strip searches and interrogation and being asked to show different kinds of medical records are still common in borders. In fact, they're ever more common in borders. But the origin came from a pandemic. Okay, so with that little bit of history, it's a little parable, I want to just say a few things. So first, one lesson we learn is that in the US context, pandemic was a pretext for border security expansion. That's the obvious point. Pandemic brought more borders. More interestingly and more subtly is that it did so in very different ways. So the 1909 pandemic was a justification for perimeter security, walling. But the 1917-18 typhus pandemic was a justification for invasive protocols at ports of entry, very different kinds of policies. So it's not just that the pandemic can spur border security expansions, it's that it does so in a lot of different ways. So if we're being vigilant about it, we have to be attentive to those ways. But the second thing is that the influence of the pandemic on border policy was incredibly delayed. Okay, so obviously a pandemic in the 1880s, it's a long time, 2 decades basically, before they made fencing in 1909. Same can be said about the typhus outbreak, was 1917, but the justification of body searches really took off because of course you have to build up the institution for this stuff way into the 30s. That this stuff really became the practice and the norm and the protocol. So the point is we should be careful if we're being critical of pandemic now in the present context. We should be careful about drawing conclusions in the near term because actually it'll extend to the long term. And most importantly, we have to understand that there's a difference in reading the pandemic or understanding the pandemic as a threat versus as a justification. Right now, there is still a threat of COVID, but the justification of using expansive border protocols could long exceed the threat. We were using the justification of typhus way after typhus was gone. The same was true of border threats. So it means we have to be, once we know there's a delay, we should be more concerned with the way border policies are justified than the threat language itself. Finally, it's amazing how quick the epidemiological concern took on a national character. So in the 1880s, it was on cows. They quickly became Mexican cows, right? The Mexican bump. Which were to be kept off our land. In the 1910s and 20s, dirty, unhygienic, infected Mexicans, this is the Mexican bump, were the problem. So even though diseases are non-national, and in fact, diseases are the most non-national thing in politics, right? They're explicitly non-national. The fact that they very quickly morph into being used to justify national exclusion is something we should be very wary of. And you saw this in Trump's language, referring to COVID as essentially the Chinese virus, right? Okay, finally, and I'm wrapping up now. I realize I'm almost out of time. I will be quick in the wrap up. So a couple of things I think this tells us looking ahead and going back into the trends that I started out the talk with. First thing is we need to be very vigilant with COVID about allowing it to become a justification for selective admissions. In other words, we already have selective admissions, and you notice that those are often racially prejudiced. We tend to make it harder for people coming from non-white, non-Christian, poor backgrounds. Will not surprise anyone if people use COVID as a pretext to extend all of those biases in a new justified way, saying, well, let's say a person's coming from, I don't know, France. We trust France. It's a Christian white first world country. We're going to say we trust their medicals. We trust their COVID vaccines. We trust their papers, their COVID, the QR codes we all now carry on our phones. But a person coming from somewhere in sub-Saharan Africa, who we already wanted to keep out because they were non-white and poor, we're going to create a pretext using the justification of COVID to say, well, the only reason we're keeping them out is because we don't trust their medical data. So that's a pretext, a justification that we should be vigilant and concerned about. The second is local. We have to be careful about it becoming racially discriminatory at home and involving profiling. I would not be surprised at all to see Mexicans in the American borderlands stopped and asked for their QR codes in ways that are at checkpoints in ways that white travelers wouldn't be. We have to be vigilant. And finally, we have to see that what's happening with COVID, especially with the way we now carry medical passports, medical visas with us. We no longer travel just with passports. We now travel with our QR data, right? What you're getting is a return to this very older imperial idea where it's not a strict citizen in a territory relationship with a state, but a much broader one that crosses borders and is digitalized. So all the trends we saw earlier and their imperial manifestations end up getting worsened and extending through the COVID era. So those are the ways we might be concerned about COVID extending even after the threat of COVID is long gone. Okay, thank you.
Thanks very much, Matthew. I think fascinating presentation. I think many of us have noticed the striking similarities between the past and the present from Matthew's presentation. So our next speaker is Tao Wing. Tao Wing is professor of political science at the University of Macau, and his research includes, East Asian politics, as well as political economy, especially the case of China and Greater China. So today, Tao Wing is going to speak on border governance, shadow exchanges, and biosecurity during COVID-19. Over to you, Tao Wing.
Thank you, Michael. Let me first share my screen. Okay. Can you see the screen clearly?
Yeah, it looks good. Yes.
Okay, thanks. Oops. Let me check. Okay. Now, today I'm going to talk about border governance, shadow exchange, and biosecurity during COVID-19. In the last couple of years, I've been looking at transnational shadow exchanges, smuggling activities, money laundering, and other types of parallel trade, suitcase trade across different national borders. When Chris invited me to join the conference, I thought, it would be interesting to know how the shadow exchanges are being affected by the pandemics because of border closures. So I start digging up into some of the news materials and so on to look at how shadow exchange are being shaped and affected by the current pandemic. But of course, since fieldwork during this particular period of time is totally impossible, traveling has been severely restricted. So what am I going to talk about just right now? It's a kind of a reliance on news reportings, some, how should we say, interview records posted in social medias, etc. And I think it would be good to share some of the preliminary findings, but mind you that this is not really deep into that fieldwork experience. So this is just some preliminary observations. Now, shadow exchange. Let me start with a very brief overview of that. This picture is taken in the border between China and Vietnam, between Dongxing City and Mong Cai. And this is a footbridge connecting the two borders. And you can see there are lots of people over here. And these people are engaging not in normal touristic activities. They are just doing suitcase trade, basically smuggling. And every day you see a lot of these kind of activities. So in a normal working day, shadow exchange actually has become a rather routine cross-border activities along many different borders, and not just in Asia, but in Africa, in other places as well. But what I'm going to discuss today, it's going to focus more on the Chinese borders, bordering various different countries. And this kind of activities has become so routinized, so regularized, that we can see this as part of the cross-border activities per se, rather than seeing it as a kind of a marginal activities. And this kind of activities actually is being carrying out under the sun. This is basically, for example, in this particular photo, it's taken in broad daylight. The border guards, the customs officials, they walk past every now and then, noticing all these activities without much of an intervention, and so on and so forth. Now, in this particular instance, the question is, why are these kind of shadow trades, smuggling activities, be so prominent and widespread and so regularized without the problem of border control? And in my previous works, I argued that because in normal times we have, in many borders, we see particular types of border governance. And these particular types of border governance combines a kind of a formal regulations with informal arrangements. In different borders, they might have different informal governance mechanisms, but in general, we can find that this kind of governance mechanisms are in place, partly because there are a number of factors that shape this kind of border governance. They are shaped by the border policies, the administrative capacities in border control, the border economies, and the nature of the border boundary itself. First of all, border policies. I argue that the border policies are mostly overdetermined. They are shaped by a combination of different policies with conflicting goals. Very often there are different layers of overlapping authorities and responsibilities. So on the one hand, the border authorities have to take into consideration certain official goals, such as promoting trade, increasing the source of cheap labor, enhancing bilateral cooperation, improving connectivities, implementing strategic regional goals such as Belt and Road Initiative, grant projects, etc. And at the same time, they have to safeguard national security, filtering out unwanted goods and people, preventing the spreads of pandemic disease, just Matthew has discussed, sustainability of border economies, accommodating daily interactions between different border cultures, etc. So all this comes together and fall on the lap of the border control authorities, which is not quite easy to make a good negotiations of that. So at the end, they can only rely on certain discretions and institute improvisations to negotiate all these different conflicting goals and arrangements. At the same time, border control also relies on the administrative capacities of the border controls. This is quite obvious, especially in the case of China. China shares its border with 14 different countries. So the borderline is really, really long, and it's not quite easy to make a very effective control of all the border checks. Imagine, for example, in Macau, where I'm residing at the moment, before the pandemic, every year we have something around 30 million visitors crossing over its borders of all kinds, 30 million per year. If every one of all those passengers have to be checked thoroughly through the border control, it would be a nightmare. It would just be totally impossible. And Macau has a population of only 600,000. So 600,000 population supporting a customs control of a couple of thousands have to check through 30 million passengers, which is totally impossible. So they have to rely on intuition. They have to rely on spot checks. They have to rely on selective examination and inspections of different passages. And this would be stretching to the limit if they tries to make it a more thorough checking. And thirdly, we have these very fuzzy boundaries as well. Macau, it's a kind of an internal border, which is a rather exception. But for all these external borders, China's border with Myanmar, China's border with Vietnam, China's border with Russia and Central Asia, etc., in all the border communities, they actually have a long historical and social legacies of mixing together cross marriages. Some share the same drinking water and the same river. Some actually share family ties at different within the village. And at certain point in history, that kind of a village was cut into half through a certain artificially set up borders, dividing the communities into two. And because of that, people still engage in daily operations, daily communications with one another. So the boundary of a rigid border, it's becoming rather difficult to maintain in such community settings and social settings. So the boundary can be quite fuzzy at this point in time. A lot of research has been done on this about the porous nature of borders. So I won't go deep into that. But that adds to the problem of maintaining a certain rigidity of the border. And that, in a way, boils down to the questions that supposedly the border checkpoints are a very heavily regulated space. It is a manifestation of state sovereignty at the frontier. And yet within this highly regulated space, we have a proliferation of unregulated activities like shadow exchanges, smuggling, illicit trade, happening within broad daylight under the eyes of the state. So how should we explain to that? And in my earlier studies, I argue that because of these various factors added together, local customs authorities and border authorities enjoy a certain degree of discretion. They can exercise their discretion in selecting passages. And because of that, it allows the smugglers and border guards to negotiate a certain understanding about permeability. What is allowed, what is not allowed, what can be done in certain way for certain types of goods at certain time of the period, at a certain sensitive timing, etc., etc. So that boils down to kind of a common understanding. And there's a kind of a common symbiotic relations that emerge that eventually form a kind of informal governance together with formal regulations. And the border checkpoints or the border guards exercise this dual role in enforcing a formal arrangement on the one hand, if they wish, or fall back to an informal understanding at other times in order to accommodate all these discretionary arrangements.
Hi, Tevin, sorry for interrupting. I just noticed that your slide is not moving, just to make sure it's not because of any technical difficulty.
No.
Okay, I'm sorry. So please keep going. Yeah.
Okay. And now it's moving. So I argue that there's a symbiotic relationship between the smugglers and border control. This photo, I'm not sure if it's clear enough.
Tevin is still not moving. We are still on slide 1 from our share screen.
Slide 1. Oh, okay.
Yes.
Why is this?
And that's why I asked. Sorry.
Is this better? Okay, so in that case, sorry about that. So maybe I should use this one rather than just for the full picture.
Yeah, no problem. It's working now.
Yeah. Okay. Now this is a picture that I've just told you about in the border bridge taken in between Dongxing and Macau in China and Vietnam. This is an interesting pattern that may be worth just explaining it a little bit further. Now, this side, can you see my mouse pointer?
Yes, it's moving.
Yes, this side is the Chinese side, and this side is the Vietnamese side. So normally on a daily basis, commodities and goods will be carried out by the Chinese couriers from this side, pass through the border control, and then take it to the Vietnamese side for distributions to the rest of the country. Now, it involves with a very interesting pattern. In order to allow the maximum labor efficiency, this pattern emerged. So every time, twice, once in the morning around 9 o'clock and once in the evening around 6 o'clock, we have this, how should we say, a synchrony of movement of people from two sides. The Chinese couriers will load their goods, pass through the customs, and then unload their goods in the middle of the bridge. That's the border point between China and Vietnam. And these goods will be taken in stock by the brokering agents. And then at the same time, couriers from the Vietnamese side will come over to the collecting point and then collect and load up the goods and then return to the Vietnamese side. And from that, they will unload it to the collecting points and immediately return to pick up another round of goods. So by doing this way, we calculate the running time for every hour. They will be at least be able to carry the loads and unload the goods 3 times per hour. But if you do it just from doing for a single person, carrying the products from one side to the other side, it may take more than an hour in return for them. So this is a way that they can arrange for the maximum efficiency. So basically, the illicit exchanges take place at this conjuncture. This is exactly the border. There is a red line dividing up the Chinese territory with the Vietnamese territory. And this is carried out being under the broad daylights. From time to time, we see border control people just come and inspect and look at how people are behaving. Make sure that they are not quarreling, make sure that they are not fighting, make sure there's nothing violence is just taking place. But other than that, they just tolerate this kind of activities. And the activity has to be synchronized, because otherwise you can carry goods and unload it here without people picking up from the other side, which is not working. So they have to synchronize it at the same time, around 9 o'clock in the morning, about 6 o'clock in the evening. And outside those hours, the bridge will be taken over by normal tourists. Lots of Chinese tourists just comes from the Chinese side, goes to Macau for shopping, for sightseeing, and so on and so forth. And then this shadow exchange just disappears. And then it reappears at a specific time. So this is a kind of a symbiotic relationship that developed, that the shadow exchange will take place at a particular point of time, at particular junctures, under the tacit approval of the border controls, with the understandings that they couldn't take in their illicit activities certain forbidden goods, such as, say, forbidden animal parts, hard drugs, etc., in a limited quantity, conducted in a peaceful way, and so on and so forth. And this particular pattern, it's interesting, but I visited many different areas across different borders. And this is unique for the Sino-Vietnamese border, but other types of patterns also emerge in other borders, such as the Sino-Kazakhstani border, in Sino-Russian border, etc. So it's different border has its idiosyncratic patterns, but the kind of symbiotic relationships can also be found. Now, the question is, with the pandemic, it raised the questions of biosecurities, because with this kind of illicit exchanges, not just including the goods, but also illicit exchanges involving illicit human migrants, human trafficking, and so on and so forth. You have a lot of problems because human mobilities are unchecked, and basically they are untracked, because if they're illegal immigrants, you cannot track them. You're not sure whether they are infected with the disease or not. And of course, they're goods, they are not sterilized, they are not going through normal checks and sterilization processes. So you cannot be sure whether they would pose a biosecurity threat to both sides. So because of that, border controls become stricter. Now, this is the part. Of course, after the pandemic, China imposed one of the most strictest border control systems in the world. And this is interesting because then we can take a look at how effective border control is during this particular period of time. And we see that from the very first beginning, there are dynamics. And this dynamics concerns with capacity overstretching. Now, China shares the land borders with 14 states, which is a lot. Just take an example of the Yunnan province. Yunnan province shares more than 4,000 kilometers borders with Myanmar, Vietnam, and Laos. Very, very long border. So in order to be able to keep out all these illegal immigrants and illegal goods, it becomes rather difficult in fencing off every single inch within the border. So in Yunnan border, in the Yunnan province, there are 8 border prefectures, 25 border counties, 19 national ports, 6 provincial ports, 65 passages for border residents. And these are official passages. These are all official checkpoints. And just manning these official checkpoints is already difficult. And in addition to that, there are countless roads, pathways, rivers, etc., that you have to gate it off for these illegal goods and immigrants. And that proved to be extremely difficult. So in the initial phase of the border control exercise, China actually have to set up fences, and later on, they actually mobilize militias in order to safeguard these borders, in order to look at all, to make sure that these border points are being taken care of. But still, there are lots of loopholes allowing people to get through. For example, when the pathways and the roads are being blocked, people started to use sewage tunnels. They turn to the sewage tunnels in order to escape border controls. So in a way, it's not entirely effective. And worse still, it creates a paradox, because stricter border control actually creates more demands for smuggling. Because of this, of the border control, then you create a lot of the normal trades cannot be done, but the demand is still there. So people switch to shadow exchanges in order to get those supplies. And ironically, we can see that this is official statistics. The illicit immigration actually soared in all border cities. So the prosecuted cases increased 90% in 2020, meaning that there are more people getting arrested for illegal immigrations than before. And of course, this can partly show that because of the stricter control, so that more people are being arrested for that. But at the same time, it also shows that illegal immigration actually soared in most of the border cities, because more people tries to escape border control in order to find jobs, but also to meet family members and also to take with them goods and commodities that are in great demand in other side of the border. And we also see diversion of shadow trade from one city to another. For example, the shadow exchange in Macau has been on the rise after the border is closed in Hong Kong. Before that, Hong Kong used to be, Michael would know a lot about this, and Chris, of all these suitcase traders in Shang Shui, in Tuen Mun, in the border towns every day. But once the border has been closed, a lot of all these activities have been shut down. So a lot of these shops, the parallel shops in Shang Shui, were closed down. But it didn't stop the suitcase traders from doing this smuggling works. They simply relocate their activities. So they shifted their activities into Macau. So Macau saw a tremendous, sharp rise in these activities. So a lot of the demands, a lot of the milk powders, a lot of the wines, a lot of the cigarettes are channeled through Macau into mainland China, into Guangdong area. So they simply divert the trade routes from one city over to the others. So at the end, we still see a lot of movement of people and goods into the border cities. And because of that, of course, we see that a lot of outbreaks experienced in the border towns of Suifenhe, which is actually the border to Russia, in Ruili, the border towns to Yunnan, in Dongxing, the border towns to Vietnam. So still, it's not easy. So you can have a strict control, but paradoxically, it is not completely effective. Now, the more effective way to do so is by lockdowns. This is a lot more effective in controlling mobility than border control. We know about the story of Shanghai. It's reported a lot, but actually in a lot of the border towns in China, the lockdowns are a lot more severe than Shanghai. Ruili, for example, has been locked down 9 times already, in total 160 days. Suifenhe, more than 90 days. Dongxing, 60 days. They seldom appears in reports because they are small places. So they're not really well connected to the rest of the world, but they are really the livelihood of the border population. So this lockdown has a devastating effect for border economies. For example, in Ruili, out of 380,000 residents, about 200,000 has already left, because there's no ways that you can earn a living in that particular area. In Dongxing, where I visited before the pandemic, normally there's about 200,000 residents, and now half of them have already left the place. So you have a devastating economies for that. So overall impact, I would say, well, stricter border control, shadow exchanges continue in various forms. It is not particularly effective in doing so, but lockdown would create a complete halt for shadow activities. However, it cannot last long, as we all know. This is just such an extreme measures that you might be effective in a short period of time, but it cannot last for long, because it was devastating for local economy and also for the people. But whatever the case, both measures will destroy the informal border mechanisms that has been at work for a rather substantial period of time. The kind of understandings, the kind of mutual negotiations, tacit approval of border controls about how the shadow exchange has been conducted is being destroyed. And after the pandemic, if that really proliferate again, it has to emerge into a way of doing so. And how that is going to be done, I think that will be the challenge for the next research. So I'll just stop here.
Thanks very much, having a wonderful presentation and pictures and information about the very much unnoticed shadow exchanges. Very interesting. So our third speaker needs no introduction. He's the host of this workshop, and Dr. Chris Szabla, who is the Global Academic Fellow and our colleague at the HKU Law Faculty. Chris researches comparative law, legal history, as well as mobility with a focus on borders and migration. So today he's going to speak on inbound quarantine regulations in colonial Hong Kong. Over back to you, Chris.
Thanks, Michael. I'll share my screen as well. So hopefully you can all see that. It's not a problem. Good. Okay, I'll assume everyone is able to see the slides. So yes, I'm going to be speaking about quarantine regulations in colonial Hong Kong, which I think is a surprisingly under-researched topic, given the very difficult quarantine regulations that exist in Hong Kong today. And I'm going to be focusing on a slightly different type of border than either Matthew or Tok Wing discussed. Most of their presentations have to do with land borders, but I'm going to be focusing on the harbor of colonial Hong Kong, which was sort of, you could say, the kind of international airport of the time, with ships arriving from destinations all over the world. Of course, there's a long kind of discourse in scholarship about the historical border between Hong Kong and China, the land border, and the land border being relatively open. But there was a site for border control in the harbor, and in particular, a site for disease-related border control that I'm going to be discussing. So just to be clear, I'm not going to be discussing the entire 150-year history of colonial Hong Kong. I'm going to be focusing on the period just after the outbreak of the third plague pandemic, very famous outbreak in colonial Hong Kong, beginning in 1894. And which then reverberated throughout the world, and which led Hong Kong to want to protect itself from the recursion of the plague, which sort of broke out for international, in terms of international visibility in Hong Kong itself. And beyond solely looking at inbound quarantine, because it's also interesting, I wanted to sort of explore the fact that Hong Kong, being an entrepot between different ports, can demonstrate through communications between these ports sort of how other ports in the region also enforce quarantine against ships coming from Hong Kong as well, or against one another. And I want to sort of think about some of the implications for contemporary law and disease control at borders to the extent that I can. So, as I mentioned, the 1894 plague first burst into international attention in Hong Kong, initiating the first plague pandemic. However, the response to this should be seen in the context of a longer-term concern with other pandemics in Asia, particularly cholera, starting in the mid-19th century onwards. So there's really kind of a framework for thinking through how to quarantine and regulate movement on the basis of the outbreaks of these pandemics when the plague outbreak hit. Also contextually important was the fact that there was sort of ongoing scientific and political debate about how disease spread. There was, on the one hand, a kind of declining theory of miasma, in which the idea was local air kind of infected you with the disease, and that meant that movement wasn't that important in terms of its spread. And it was only sort of local sanitary measures that could contain disease by containing this miasma. And on the other hand, the contagion theory, which of course was much more important for movement, because if one person could infect another person, that would mean that would have the implication that their quarantine was necessary to prevent that infection. But of course, on the other hand, even as the contagion theory sort of gained prominence, there was a growing concern for disruption of commerce and other needs facilitated by movement, by quarantine and by restrictions on movement, especially with growing volumes of trade in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So this is sort of a paradox here where there was a growing understanding that people could communicate disease to one another, but on the other hand, there was an unwillingness to accept the consequences of doing so. So in Hong Kong, what was the legal framework by which quarantine was instituted? After it had been domesticated into the competence of local legislation, we find this in the merchant shipping consolidation ordinances. And I'm not going to go through each one. It's constantly updated and amended throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But essentially, in each one of these updates, we find several common features, which is ships with cases and deaths on board could obviously trigger quarantine, but also the governor and council could proclaim another port infected. And that meant that if a ship was coming from one of those infected ports, there would be consequences when that ship arrived in a Hong Kong harbor in terms of the extent to which quarantine regulations could be imposed on them. If anyone violated these quarantine orders, there would be potentially a large fine and even up to a year in prison, and that included anyone who was servicing the ship or anyone who had contact with people who were servicing the ship. Expenses for the quarantine period would have to be paid by vessel owners. So if you brought potentially, in terms of how was it judged, disease into Hong Kong, it would be sort of on you to deal with the expense of providing food for those who are on board being quarantined. But as I mentioned, there were constant shifts in how this legislation looked and was shaped, and that was sort of based on the shifting medical consensus with regard to, first of all, miasma and contagion, and then the balance between commerce and disease control, and also sort of thoughts about the extent to which the city itself could kind of take infection based on its own local sanitary measures. Okay, and in addition to the merchant shipping consolidation ordinances, and I should also say, of course, the governor can make regulations under this ordinance, and this is an example of which you see it at the right. So there was kind of additional dispensation for additional regulations under this, but also in addition to all of this, there was international, there was an international legal component to quarantine regulation in Hong Kong that was increasingly introduced, which were the international sanitary conventions. And sort of surprisingly, it seems there's been very little note of how these conventions were brought in and applied in East Asia. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that in the latter part of the presentation. So just to give you a sense of how kind of quarantine changes with the evolution of this legislation over time. In 1886, Hong Kong broke with the increasing British practice of moving away from quarantine on the grounds that Hong Kong as a city, as a port, was not sanitary enough. It couldn't take inbound disease. It would lead to kind of catastrophic outbreak. This sort of understanding, right, that it's uniquely positioned as a place in Asia, and it couldn't necessarily copy the regulations that were in force in the UK. But of course, this was controversial, especially with the business community, and it's sort of seemingly as a compromise with them, the quarantine period that was enforced was increasingly reduced from 10 to 5 to then 3 days. And then by 1892, there was a commission on quarantine to sort of decide whether or not to reduce it further. There was testimony, especially from medical practitioners, that quarantine doesn't work, that it's contrary to modern English ideas of sanitation to have quarantine at all, an emphasis on vaccination. So all this feels very, very familiar with regard to the distinction between Hong Kong maintaining quarantine today and the UK practice of eliminating all of these restrictions. One thing that kept the commission from eliminating quarantine at all, however, was the political concern for feelings of neighbors. So you can sort of read this contextually, potentially as kind of concerned that if Hong Kong reduced or eliminated quarantine entirely, that there would be a reaction from neighboring ports. They would kind of wall themselves off from Hong Kong in concern that Hong Kong would sort of more easily introduce disease into itself. So there's a sort of paradox there in which the reduction of quarantine would potentially lead to actually Hong Kong having less commerce with these neighboring ports in the rest of the region. So as a consequence of the commission, in 1892, the governor introduced a regulation that only ports within 3 days could be declared infected, which eliminates a lot of potential ports from quarantine screenings. And there was a move toward inspection and more discretionary quarantine as opposed to a need to impose quarantine on all inbound ships from these infected ports. But this came right before the outbreak of the 1894 plague, and there was a reaction to this in which quarantine became increasingly accepted again. And so by 1897, there was a move then again away from this limitation. All ports could be subject to quarantine again. So what exactly did, in practice, quarantine look like? So originally, there was a definitive kind of on-land quarantine required, including disembarkation and a stay in a specified quarantine station, which was on, for those of you who know Hong Kong, on Stonecutters Island. By the 1890s, as kind of mentioned in the previous slide, right, there was a shift toward this more discretionary quarantine, and this quarantine was on ship in an anchorage in the harbor at the determination of a health officer who would conduct a mandatory inspection of incoming ships, especially those coming from ports that were declared infected. And if there were cases found on ship, they were either removed to a hospital ship or an on-land hospital. But suspected cases, so contacts, for example, or those seen as suspicious by the health officer, and this is where the discretion is important and significant, could be kept in shipboard quarantine. And there were different sort of temporal limits to how long that could be. And what you can see is a sort of evolution. So in 1899, it was proposed this period only be 48 hours. In 1901, it was left to the discretion of the health officer, but they were given potentially more time. So actually, more people could be kept in quarantine for longer on this discretionary basis. But it could be played for the business community, for example, as the hard definitive commitment to quarantine for a given period of time was not necessarily there. And even with the increase in discretion, it didn't mean that specific procedures were not actually gazetted. So there were even specific foods prescribed during the quarantine period, which by 1908 had been kind of redescribed as so-called observations. It's another kind of example of a means by which the government could claim that it was reducing quarantine, but not actually doing so. They claimed, okay, we don't have quarantine anymore, we have observation. So let me just give you some visuals on what exactly this looks like. So the health officer would kind of row out from or push off from the hospital, which again, for those of you who know Hong Kong, was in County Town, originally a smallpox hospital, but adapted after the plague for many different kinds of cases. The ships coming in would stay originally in a quarantine anchorage, which was statutorily defined as being in this space in the harbor. I've laid it onto a map of contemporary Hong Kong. After a period of time, when quarantine was kind of redefined as observation, they moved to another location after their inspection in the quarantine anchorage, which was the Lai Chi Kok observation station, a little further, you could say, from population center at the time. And so here's an example of a very specific kind of menu that could be prescribed during this observation period. And it's sort of, I think, interesting to note. Obviously, there's a sort of racialized component to who is designated for quarantine during this period, and we see that it's not only segregated, but there's not even a contemplation here that Europeans or those who would desire a European menu would be those designated for quarantine, which is interesting. I mean, we know there are examples of enforcement of quarantine against, for example, European ship captains, but not seemingly contemplated in this paradigm of observation, at least in terms of. So a big question of course, given the way that the legislation was laid out, was how could a port be declared infected? What were the criteria that went into what an infected port was? And this is a map of basically most of the ports that Hong Kong was in communication with regard to the status of disease in these locations. As you can see, most of the ports are in the blue highlighted Asia-Pacific region. But actually, most of the ports that Hong Kong wound up declaring infected were within the kind of red circle. They were within this sort of relatively brief 3-day journey with this sort of potential idea that maybe ship was no longer dangerous after a longer journey. But I just want to explore what led to some of these decisions. So sort of discursively in terms of how these ports were discussed, sort of divided them into 3 categories. There's sort of the Chinese cities on the one hand, British empire cities or ports on the other, and then finally other ports. So those in other European powers colonies and in independent Asian states. And the way that the infected declaration worked was that the governor would get a recommendation from the sanitary board. So these designations are based on the determinations of the sanitary board and the kind of deliberations that they made in terms of making those determinations. And what we see in regard to the Chinese ports, for example, many ports were declared infected. There are many infection declarations in the 20-year period between the outbreak of the plague and the outbreak of the First World War, which reshaped shipping patterns to some extent. And they had vague information from these ports, but there was a high degree of interaction. So both of these factors really weigh on whether they're going to determine whether one of these ports are infected. These ports are important, of course, for Hong Kong's commerce. With regard to the British Empire ports, they received very detailed information about disease raging there. But even if they have a sense that disease is very prevalent in these ports, many of them are potentially distant, and that could lead to a determination that maybe disease had dissipated on board a ship arriving from there. And then finally, there are the other ports for which there were many infection declarations, variable information quality, in some cases very good information quality, but low trust. And so I just want to explore momentarily how some of these determinations worked. So when I say that the quality of the information received from the Chinese ports was low, it was because they were sourcing them primarily from local British council and sometimes other European intermediaries like missionaries, and they relied on rumors and data about European cases only that they knew in these ports, or just a vague sense of the intensity of illness compared to previous seasons. And so as a consequence, these ports could be declared infected seemingly easily and often, but the status was lifted often also, and it seems potentially that the volume of interaction of their trade with Hong Kong was a factor in this. Just some examples of the information problem. The sanitary board was receiving communications about Canton, for example, saying they knew about Europeans, but it was very difficult to ascertain to what extent the disease is prevalent among Chinese. Council from there was writing, for some time in the past, there have been rumors of sickness due to the improper condition of water supply. Only knew about Europeans' deaths, but speculated that it was a product of excessive drinking from a well surrounded by Chinese buildings. In Swato, modern Shantou, the council wrote, as you are doubtless aware from conditions prevailing in China, it is almost impossible for me to obtain from native sources any but the vaguest intelligence, right? So they're relying on these exclusive networks of Europeans only and not really having a sense of the prevalence of disease. And so the consequence of this is, you see based on vague information, declarations of infected status in ports like Amoy, modern Xiamen, or Dutrang, modern Yingkou, but also, again, a reluctance where, trade could be preserved to impose infected status. So Fuchao, modern Fuzhou, Council noted that the native city was infected, but at least the anchorage was not, and so this was not declared infected. Okay, so what about the British ports? So I mentioned that they received very detailed information from these ports. And so you can see one is a statement from Bombay with really high case and death totals. One is a very detailed statement from Brisbane, sort of tracking different cases in the city, knowing even their addresses, where they had been, even tracing cases in rats, for example. But even given high number of cases, and even given this detailed information, infected status was very, very rarely declared on these British ports. And it sort of opens questions about why this was the case. Did it reflect Hong Kong's greater adhesion to kind of more open British position on quarantine with regard to other British ports? Did it arise from trust in their sanitary state compared to other ports? Or was it this question of distance that I mentioned before? And I think one way we can evaluate this is to look at the one British port that Hong Kong did impose infectedness status on, which was Singapore. So there was a certain reluctance to impose a status on Singapore. One sanitary board member noted, unless we have definite figures, I don't think it would be justified in declaring them infected. But there was a certain pressure, given a sense that disease was emanating from there. And the press, for example, uses sort of military metaphor that they were being invaded by plague potentially on multiple sides, both from Chinese ports, but also from Singapore. That having been said, you can kind of see these cross influences at work, because many ports would often proclaim Singapore, many other ports would often proclaim Singapore infected, but Hong Kong seemed reluctant to do so, even though it relatively often proclaimed it infected. And so trying to think of the distinction potentially between Singapore and some of these other ports, one factor might be this distance question. That might help explain it, although of course we can speculate on others. And just look at the other ports. So I mean, again, these were often declared infected as well. Often they had sort of variable quality of data, and that allowed for some of these decisions to be made. There was the basis on which some of these decisions were made. Particularly when it could be said that the variable quality of data meant that the data was untrustworthy, and therefore these ports had to be excluded. And an interesting example of this, just skipping to the last of these here, was Macau, because Macau actually provided very, very intensive data to Hong Kong, but it could still be occasionally proclaimed infected. And so just to give you an example of this data here, so Macau put out these documents called necrological bulletins, sometimes in French, sometimes in Portuguese, for different ports in the region, with all kinds of information about the status of disease in these ports. And even when they showed relatively low prevalence of disease, and I should clarify that I'm controlling here obviously for the actual numbers themselves, right, in terms of comparing these. Even when they showed relatively low prevalence of disease, Consul in Macau could say, look, this data, even though it looks beautiful, it's well presented, it's not trustworthy. And on that basis, Hong Kong would still declare it an infected port. So trust was more important in this case than the quality of the information. And that was actually true for Singapore with regard to Macau as well. It also proclaimed Macau infected despite receiving this information. So, as I mentioned before, the kind of documents available in terms of Hong Kong's communication with other ports also provide a window on how they thought about Hong Kong and how they thought about quarantine more generally. And there are often very similar regulations to Hong Kong's. In fact, Fiji's seem as if they're almost word to word very similar in some periods of time during the period that I've been looking at. But there are potentially, there are distinctions at times with regard to certain ports. So certain ports have much less autonomy, for example, than Hong Kong. So Indian ports had to some extent more similar autonomy because India was divided into these different presidencies, and they were able to make their own determinations regarding whether or not another port was infected. But Portuguese ports did not seem to have this level of autonomy, and actually decisions about ports that were infected for the Portuguese Empire were made centrally. So they were made in Lisbon. And of course, the consequence of that was that it was very difficult for Hong Kong to lobby and negotiate with, for example, Macau, right? Because the decision was not made in Macau, it was made very distantly in Lisbon. And so officials in London would have to sort of lobby on Hong Kong's behalf as a consequence of that. One port's decision could affect others. So Hong Kong had the sort of ability to, used its discretion not to necessarily go along with other ports' decisions, but often there was a sort of cascading effect of one port deciding to declare another infected, leading to sometimes determinations that didn't really make sense to Hong Kong. So very often they would receive notice that a number of ports had declared them infected, and then they would wonder why. I mean, they had never sent out data, and so it seems to have been a product of this sort of groupthink among other ports and a precautionary principle of declaring each other infected. And then finally, just to sort of get into this point, there was a growing concern for international law and how it regulated quarantine, especially in Indian ports. And this is how it sort of enters the region. So the international sanitary conferences and later convention were at first concerned with cholera, and they were first concerned with how that emerged from India. It sort of led to regulation in Indian ports with the idea that it would help secure Europe from disease. Because the idea was that commerce and maritime connections between India and the Middle East and then Europe were leading to the introduction of cholera into Europe. But sort of not factored into any of this was the fact that India was, of course, trading with the rest of East Asia as well. And so increasingly, the international sanitary conference norms and conventions become a means by which quarantine is regulated in East Asian ports as well. And this is also true with regard to plague. So a number of international sanitary conventions become introduced with regard to plague specifically, the first being the Venice Convention of 1897. And the difficulty of the Venice Convention for Hong Kong was that it specified this requirement that 10 days had to pass without a case or a death in a port before clean bills of health could be issued for ships. So if any case popped up within that 10-day period, the clock was reset, and Hong Kong had to constantly wait for a free 10-day period before other ports would release their declaration of infectedness status on it. For those of you in Hong Kong, this might seem very familiar because sort of similar criteria for opening the mainland border there was an issue for much of last year. By 1903, the Paris Convention introduced a reduced requirement to 5 days of freedom from cases or deaths, but it introduced also more conditions, which was controversial among the business community in Hong Kong. So there was a bit of controversy in Hong Kong because it had the capacity independent of Britain to accede to these conventions, but sort of didn't necessarily matter given that other ports were increasingly signing on to the conventions, or at least following the norms of these conventions in their interactions with one another, especially given that many Indian ports were following them to the letter. And so they increasingly become norms. And on that basis, actually, even before Hong Kong acceded to these conventions, it starts to use their language to justify its decisions about assigning infectedness status to other ports. So at one point, there's a bit of nervousness about Tientsin, modern Tianjin, having an outbreak. The consul in Tianjin noted that most of the city was free from disease, but the port was only practically free. And so the argument from the sanitary board, and this is before Hong Kongers even acceded to the convention, was that the convention allowed for a precise location to be declared infected. So on that basis, they were able to say, okay, the city of Tianjin is not necessarily infected, but there might be some cases in the port. We'll declare it infected, citing the Venice Convention. This language also creeps into Hong Kong's lobbying against being declared infected by other Asian ports. So one thing is that they dispute what no case really means under the convention. Looking at precedents of other Asian ports, they state that Manila takes forever with its determinations of whether a case is present. Therefore, Hong Kong can do so as well. And if you take forever with your determination of whether a case had actually been a case, that means that the 10-day period can actually go by without a case having been declared, and Hong Kong could therefore be declared free from infection. And another approach they take is reading together articles of the convention to impose new interpretations of it. So different articles impose different standards based on thinking about ports as a whole or based on thinking about ships. And the Chamber of Commerce makes arguments to the Sanitary Board to the effect of, if there's a lower standard for ships than for ports, this sort of points to the fact that the intent, the object and purpose of the convention, as international lawyers would say, was not for this 10-day period to be as kind of unsurmountable as it seems to be. And they were trying to make an argument on this basis that a sporadic case in the port itself didn't really matter as long as ships were free of the disease that were coming from that port. So I just want to end by speculating on some contemporary implications. So obviously, a theme that's come up both in this panel and in previous panels in the past over the last day, trust is deeply important in terms of whether or not a jurisdiction will open its border to another one in terms of disease control. Also, going into trust is a question of bias, and I think we see some of this right in some of these determinations of infectedness status. Obviously, the conflict between commerce and disease control is another theme. The paradox, though, of Hong Kong's potential openness, leading to it being closed off by others, kind of introduces a bit of a twist to this. Another final sort of general lesson here is the potential usefulness of territorial divisions or local autonomy in making these decisions, right? Because you can maintain commerce and connection to other places, and you can more easily negotiate with those places that have closed you off or are about to close you off, if you have autonomy and if you are a smaller division of a territory. This gets back to something that, for those of you who were here at the first panel, Martin Chinen was making the case for smaller territorial divisions sort of being sealed off as opposed to national divisions or larger divisions. And then just some very brief speculations about international law as well. As we see with the Venice Convention on plague, international agreements, they can gain in this context soft law status. They can impede localized norms, but at the same time, they can also gain acceptance as clear and more legitimate bases for decisions that may have been made anyway, but sort of shape those decisions in new ways that conform a little bit more with the conventions themselves. We also see how a sort of a convention that was contemplated as being a little bit more regional can become more international. And so the sanitary conventions were never really meant to focus on East Asia, but they kind of enter the East Asian region and they start to regulate how East Asian ports kind of deal with quarantine of one another. And then finally, a point related to this with regard to the history of international law, which is that contemporaries in Asia saw these conventions as applicable to the region. Distant officials and later historians didn't necessarily. And so I think this points to the fact that the region was more integral to the history of international law with regard to border control and disease prevention, border control than potentially assumed. So thanks a lot.
Thanks very much, Chris, for this intriguing archival study of quarantine and quarantine policies in colonial Hong Kong. I think we can still feel the fact that how data communication and trust affects the quarantine policies of different places in the world. So with that, I'm now inviting questions from the floor, also as well as from the speakers. If they wish to comment and give questions, you can type out your question in the Q&A box, or you can use raise hand function so that I can invite you to ask and comment in person. So while I'm waiting for other questions to come, I have one comment and one question already from members of the audience. Wei Wen Lim, first of all, Lim said that the Cow Deep story is really interesting. The question for Matthew is that how can organizations such as the WHO prevent / avoid the quote-unquote nationalization of viruses / disease? It seems that this was achieved in the influenza A H1N1 pandemic, but not very well in the COVID-19 pandemic. May I invite Matt to respond? And while we're waiting for the question to come.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And I'm glad you like the cow dipping story. I also like the cow dipping story. I like the visual it forced you to embrace. I think the issue of nation, the problem in all the ways that nationalism gets mobilized tends to be about information. And the truth is that COVID, in the beginning, we had so little information, it was easy to vilify origins and therefore China. The moment it became more a thing that we understood, that became less plausible. So the concern is that much of this has to do with a very deliberate mishandling in the American sense about where or how informed the population was to enable nation to become effective. But the problem is states will use nation when it's in their interest. And what happened with the pandemic is it became very quickly, at least in the United States context, the one I know better, nationally valuable as a means of shutting out people you wanted to shut out and preferentially set up rules. And so in that case, it's hard to imagine nationalism would ever not be part of the toolkit of leaders. The difference with H1N1 is that at the time, the leaders in charge had less of a material interest in exploiting national sentiment, and so I fear that the comparative is unhelpful. I think that the better way to see it is that there will always be national ways in which you can use pandemic as a justification to increase border security. It's a vigilant and informed population that can stopper that, and that's probably going to be true in any context.
Thank you, Matthew. Tao-Weng has anything to add? You raise your hand.
Yeah, I have a question for Matthew, because I think the presentation is fascinating. And basically, if I understand correctly, you're arguing that pandemic has contributed to the hardening of the borders, at least in the case of the United States. And that's interesting because if we juxtapose more recent research on the questions of border, I think in the last 2-3 decades, we've seen a lot of studies arguing that the border is becoming softening. It's becoming more porous. It's becoming more mobile and moving. And that, of course, was happening without the pandemic. And now that we have a COVID-19 spreading throughout the world, do you see that it will, in a way, reverse the trend of this softening trend of the border? Would it really contribute to a rehardening of state borders and reversing the trend that we are seeing for some years?
Yeah, I think the more likely story is that this has nothing to do with hardening. I think it has to do with filtration and the ways in which we use selective admissions criteria. And my concern is that we end up using the COVID rules and medical passports and visas and new institutions we set up as a justification for excluding people, to use Chris's language, that we trust less, regardless of how much the data might tell a different story, or we use trust as a proxy for data, right? We trust their data less, even if the data they give us is quantitatively, voluminous. And it is a type of hardening. I don't know that I think that it's the right story to say borders have hardened. I don't think it's as simple as that. I think that borders have largely changed shape in the last generations, but I don't think it's a measure of softening. I think it's a mixture of deterritorializing and becoming more variable, meaning hardening in some places and softening in others, and having ever more sophisticated tools of filtration. I think that's the better way of describing what the trend has been in bordering. In that sense, I think that COVID is only going to contribute further.
Thank you, Matt and Tao-Weng. So we have another question also for Matt. Matt, you said that we should stay vigilant about the abuse of COVID policy several times. How could we as ordinary citizens do that? Very important question.
It's a great question. Thank you, Adeline. So my general approach to this point is that citizen vigilance is everything. I don't think it's just an approach about COVID. I think that it's a general difficult relationship that I have with sovereign authority, that if people are uninformed, they can be trampled on by state figures in a really oppressive way. And I think in that sense, being aware of the ways in which our border policies have changed is the first step. But most importantly, it's trying to locate the point where the justification drifts beyond the threat. And I think that right now we still live in a world in which COVID is a threat. And therefore, the fact that we use COVID as a justification for certain kinds of border policies is okay. I don't think it's that problematic. Like the fact that when I travel, I have to bring my data in my phone. I have a QR code that legitimates my travel as a second passport is fine. The problem is that once we set up those institutions and there's new stakeholders and offices and money flows and so forth, it'll be easy to keep those systems in place in some degree or another. And I think the vigilance comes in then. Once the threat subsides, if we still use this threat as a justification for continuing strict policies that should have been laxed or gone by the wayside. And that's where vigilance kicks in. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. Actually, I have a quick comment and quick questions for all three speakers. My quick comment is, today's presentations are intriguing, insightful for me, for the fact that because when we talked about border, we always talked about border controls, but actually your stories told me that the border uncontrols or the border non-control is as important as the border controls, just like what Matt mentioned about the open lawful invasion and Ted Wing's examples of lawful smuggling. So I would very much like to see more studies and your views on how border uncontrolled and non-control, whether they are important or as important or less important than border control. That's the first question. The second question for all three speakers are, how do you see global geopolitics or regional geopolitics play a role in your stories? In terms of Chris' story, say, for example, one of your archives mentioned about the feelings of neighbor. I would presume, the concerns about neighboring mainland China. And for Matt, I think the US-Mexican or South American relationship, how the geopolitics plays a role in the control. And also for Ted Wing, China-Vietnam relationship, I think that might play a role in whether the smugglings are lawful or unlawful. So please go ahead if any of you would like to respond.
Well, I can jump in by putting it kind of back onto Chris, because I really liked this idea of the thinking. This is kind of taking the prompt about geopolitics, but this point about racialization in the kinds of boats. So the idea that you'd have certain kinds of boats and certain kinds of passengers be subject to concern, where the trail of data or information and the trail of distance are perhaps proxies for race. It would be so interesting to point out, see if there's a way you can find cases where distance alone can't explain it. And therefore it has to be, or the other alternative options are thinned out. And then it has to be this idea that, well, we trust them. Okay, why do you trust them? Well, trust always has a racial predicate. I mean, in global politics. And so, yeah, if there were cases of non-distance derived racial variability in response, would be really amazing to see.
I can just respond to that. I mean, one of the things that I didn't mention is at one point, what's brought in is a potential kind of discretionary option for the health officer in the port of Hong Kong is an easier ability when there's a Chinese immigrant ship to come in to quarantine that kind of vessel specifically. And one thing you see with regard to Singapore, and this is sort of an alternative interpretation compared to the distance one, is that very often these ships are going back and forth between Hong Kong and Singapore. There is this very sort of lively migrant movement between Hong Kong and the Strait settlements, where a lot of or the Chinese immigrants worked on plantations, for example. And Singapore, again, was also a very a port that was largely populated by overseas Chinese. So you could absolutely, instead of seeing it as a more proximate British port to Hong Kong, you could see this as, okay, this is an extension of their mentality about Chinese people specifically. And so it's not about white British Europeans versus everyone else. It's about their mentality about Chinese people and their discrimination against Chinese people specifically. So that's potentially one interpretation that sort of supersedes the distance point, and especially when the Chinese immigrant vessels are written into the statute. It becomes sort of clear that there is sort of some of that going on there as well in terms of the racialization of quarantine. I guess one thing I'd say with regard to Michael's point about kind of non-enforcement of the border, right, is that this discretionary form of quarantine, it kind of reproduces some of what Talking is talking about, right? Where you have officials, they have the ability to sort of look the other way when they see something that is sort of necessary, seemingly, for a community that relies on interaction across borders, or between ports in this case, but that maybe would be controversial for some participants in the community, for example, those that were concerned with disease control in particular, to have included in sort of the legislation or regulations. So I can kind of see a correspondence there where the increasing movement toward discretion kind of allows that activity, some of that activity, to keep taking place without with the ability to continue to say, of course, we still have these sort of strict disease-related border regulations. Michael, you asked another question, but I'm struggling to remember. It was you had the question about informal kind of, or sort of the lack of border control. And then there was another point you made.
Geopolitical.
Yeah, geopolitics. Yeah, the role of geopolitics.
That's right. I don't necessarily think, I don't know that in their reference to the neighbor, I mean, contemporarily, that struck me very much as, if we read this today, it would very much be referring to, Hong Kong's neighbor to the north and its geopolitical strength and weight. But I try to be a good historian and read it contextually, because they wouldn't necessarily have all, I mean, to some extent, they do think of the Qing dynasty that way in certain contexts, in certain respects. But they also, with regard to quarantine, seem to have this mentality that, these ports are just, sites of constant, bubbling up of disease that need to be protected against. And so I think that was not necessarily their concern when they were thinking about opening. I think the concern had more to do with potentially the other colonial ports and how they perceived Hong Kong as being open to those Chinese ports, being a potential sort of vector for disease coming out of China to these other places, specifically, to other parts of the British Empire and the American colonies as well. So I was thinking of particularly sort of India, Burma, which constantly imposing restrictions on Hong Kong, but to some extent also Manila, Indochina, these places as well. So I absolutely think there's a potential to read it geopolitically, but trying to think about it contextually makes me want to be a little bit more nuanced about it, essentially.
Thank you. Terry, you want to?
Yeah, very brief response to Michael's very interesting observation. I will respond in this way. Yes, definitely control and not control is a very important aspect of border. But I wouldn't put it in a kind of a black and white, a yes or no things, because absence of control doesn't mean that then you're free to do anything. Absence of control, in between full control and the absence of control, there's still absence of control, but still with coordination. And this middle area is the ones that I'm trying to work on. And in a way, absence of official control, but it's still highly coordinated. And that's why I start to look at informal governance, because this is the part that is not using all these law and explicit regulations and open practices. but a kind of under-table practices. But at the same time, it's also observed by all the actors and players. There are still rules, but it's hidden rules. It's kind of informal rules, but there are still rules. So still people are playing it in a certain way. So that's why we can observe a certain patterns. And I think that is important. And I think that's also enormously overlooked in the existing literatures, because we tend to assume that either it's fully controlled or not controlled. But actually in the middle, there is a big middle ways of doing things. Global geopolitics, I think, as far as what I'm looking at in terms of transnational shadow exchanges, this is obviously very important, because this kind of exchange always takes into consideration of various different contexts. And in another project, I actually looked at the shadow Belt and Road connections in terms of connectivity. So in a way, those shadow exchanges actually follow the routes of official Belt and Road. And of course, this puts in a geopolitical dimension into it, because on the one hand, the state along the routes of Belt and Road is trying to normalize trade and to incorporate all kinds of economic activities into this kind of officially sanctioned realm of regulations. But local communities, people from bottom up, tries to take advantage of this opening opportunity in engaging in various kind of trading networks, but at the same time trying to stay away from this officially constructed geopolitical relationships. So it's a very complicated or twisted interactions between the official arrangement and the unofficial arrangement. They have certain clashes and they have certain meshes. And the results comes up with situations that are quite idiosyncratic in different occasions. Some were absorbed into that kind of official practices, others stayed being resisted and stayed autonomous in their interactions with these governmental initiatives. So it needs a lot of more works to do into it, but certainly I think that dimension is an important dimension in looking at global transnational trading networks.
Thanks very much, Darwin. So thanks a lot for the responses and discussions. In the interest of time, just to make sure if there's any one last questions or comments from the floor or from our speakers before we close the session. Chris and Matt, please.
I'll let Matthew speak first.
I was just going to say, no, it was really interesting. And I really found that the overlaps of the papers was really terrific. And just following off what the last comment about this idea of the vaguenesses of things that are not exactly formal or informal kinds of flows, but are this collaborative space between formal and informal. I think you're exactly right that that's the richest kind of domain. I don't now, but also always. I mean, that kind of, and the idea of this shadow economy that's tolerated but not formally is the kind of thing that all that kind of research is really terrific and interesting. And I think there's so much overlap between that kind of policy about the bridge and on the China-Vietnam border with the kinds of things about in history, the sort of informal. So what you referred to as the shadow then kind of turned into the question of trust. And in a way, they're both flip sides of the same point. Like what counts as tolerable shadow is the kind of thing we trust. And it's kind of a lot of interesting points of overlap that when you on the surface looked at our presentations, I don't know that you would have identified, but actually it was a nice conversation. So
yes. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you, Matt.
I just wanted to say, I think Matthew's point about the imperial conception of borders versus the sort of more thin line paradigm, it really applies to maybe both of these presentations. And I just wanted to sort of highlight this, right? Because I think it was really interesting. So, I mean, at the end of Dr. presentation, he's talking about how the fact that the exchanges can't be stopped is leading to outbreaks, and then it leads to lockdowns in border communities. And it started to really make me think about, this idea of the border as a zone. And so as a consequence of this activity, it sort of meant that there needed to be this sort of area, right, in which there was more stringent lockdown in order to secure more interior China from these exchanges that were leading to lockdowns. So I think it's potentially an example of where we see this expansion of the border zone, which is really interesting. And it got me thinking also about, my own presentation and these decisions about ports. It's sort of, now I'm sort of thinking of it in terms of the way that Matthew conceptualized, the way that we need to think about adhering to the requirements of the place that we travel to before we go there, so that we're not just territorially linked to where we are, but we're already kind of linked to the requirements of this other place, right? And so just like the QR code that we need to download now and upload our vaccination information to, et cetera, before we travel to a place is required, the clean bill of health was required in the late 19th century with regard to these ports, or thinking about the status of quarantine measures in a distant port that you might be traveling to, was something that needed to be thought of back then. And so, I think this is a really interesting and significant. I mean, the idea that pandemics and disease control lead to harder border control is I think very, very clear to many people. But the idea that it changes the paradigm of borders in this way, I think, is more novel insight that I'm glad to have had raised.
Thanks very much. With that, I do declare closing of this panel sessions, and thanks very much for the discussions and the presentations and the members of audience participations in this panel. But our workshop has not ended yet. We still have another panel to come in less than 2 hours time, which focuses on migrants and refugees. So stay tuned, and thanks very much for joining our workshop, and hope to see you again in the next one. Good evening and good afternoon. I'll see you. Thank you very much.
Thanks to everyone for participating. Thank you so much.
Exactly. Thank you.